And welcome to the Royal Beat Back in Time, where we delve deep into the history books to uncover the hidden stories and scandals of royalty from years gone by. And today's show is all about two people who are certainly no strangers to scandal in their lifetime: the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, also known as King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. Now, there's been much said and written about these two fascinating figures already, but today we're going to look at them through a new lens, focusing on their love of all things opulent and expensive. And nowhere was that more apparent than in their obvious love and remarkable collection of jewels and jewellery. Though in some cases, these gems appear to have lived a life almost as eventful as their owners. And one man who knows this better than most is the author of a new book called The King's Loot, the greatest royal jewellery heist in history. Richard Wallis joins us here today, as well as historian and biographer of Wallis Simpson. And Seba is back with us. Lovely to see you. And managing director and co-founder of Europe's largest online diamond jeweller, 77 Diamonds. Tobias Cormand is here as well. So lots of expertise to sit around what is an extraordinary story. So when people hear the words jewellery heist in relation to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, they may well be thinking of one notable incident, and that is the 1946 robbery in, as you say, an unsuspecting corner of Surrey. What exactly do you know for sure, having written your own book on Mrs. Simpson? What do you recall of that and her response to it?
Well, this is really Richard's field of expertise. As far as I'm concerned, I'm much more interested in what created Wallis, and what created her was jewellery. Jewellery was really the leitmotif of their entire relationship. Wallis was born to a good family, but without a father, so insecurity marked her from the get-go. And as soon as she met the Prince of Wales, she kept saying to him, "Oh, you're just a tease to any woman. I know you're not really serious. You're not going to."
She was also married at the time, right?
She was married at the time.
Now.
But the only way that the Prince of Wales, as he was then, could prove his love was by giving her jewels, setting up a trust fund for her in Canada, giving her furs, helping with all these gifts that Richard intimated to prove to Wallis that he was for real. So jewellery really marked every stage of their relationship. And Wallis writes very coyly in 1935 how the relationship moved to a new level between love and friendship when he handed her a little velvet pouch with a Cartier jewel in it. So whenever Wallis went through something particularly tough, she would shout at him and say how terrible her life was. "Oh, never mind, darling, here's another jewel." So at every stage, jewellery is what persuaded Wallis that he was for real, and then he abdicates. And suddenly she finds herself actually landed with this man who she calls Peter Pan, because she knew he was the boy who could never grow up. So there is no way of looking at their relationship without looking at how jewellery at every stage marked the relationship, how often it was engraved on the back with particular moments, the bracelet of crosses.
Of course, yes. Tell me about the bracelet of crosses. Give me an indication of
So to move right to 1946, which probably Richard should do, is you have to understand what went before it. And I'm trying to paint a picture of why jewellery was so personal to her. There is the bracelet of crosses. So the one that everybody knows is the one which has...
Well, you say everybody. I wasn't aware of it, Anne, but I'm now quite enthralled. So actually,
it was an unusual piece, and she added to it piece by piece. And engraved on the back, on one of the crosses, is this remark, "Hold tight," which, as everybody knows, is, of course, a double entendre, and I'm sure your listeners are very well aware of its double meaning. So the bracelet of crosses really meant a lot, but every piece that he gave her marked a particular stage in their relationship.
So each piece was added because they'd endured or survived another trial or tribulation, and these were all made out. I mean, Tobias, you'll be familiar with this piece. These are all precious stones.
Yeah, they are. But this is actually a great example of where something in actual value is relatively low compared to some of the extraordinary pieces that were sold off. We're talking about the 200-carat sapphire ring, and there was, you know, a gorgeous ruby and diamond necklace, which was, you know, a couple of 100 carats. So it's kind of, if you compare to those kind of things, this actually, in actual value of small rubies and sapphires and diamonds in itself, in the making and the cost.
But it indicates the essence of the relationship.
Yeah.
Who was the saint? Who was the sinner? Wallis believed that she had to endure much more public hatred, lost her good name, lost her privacy, and all Edward did was give up a throne and a kingdom. It was nothing compared to the way Wallis had suffered. So, of course, when Madonna makes her film W.E., the one piece she has to have made a facsimile. She can't get hold of the real thing. But the bracelet of crosses is absolutely crucial to conveying how Wallis felt.
So this couple, let's fast forward to 1946. We're a year out of victory in Europe.
Yes.
Britain is living on rations, food stamps.
Austerity is rife.
Austerity is rife. And these two come back to the UK carrying a ton of luggage, including a trunk full of Wallis's jewels, to stay, as you say in your book, a sleepy corner of Surrey with friends. What was the reason for them coming back? Why were they travelling with so much opulent jewellery? And talk me through then what happened next, Richard.
The speculation is that they were in Britain because the king at the time, George VI, was very ill. Edward, although he gave up the throne, he spent a lot of his time immediately afterwards trying to get back on the throne.
Did he?
To replace his brother. Absolutely. He would not let it go.
Really?
The reason why they were back in 1946 is that there was a suspicion that there would be a coup and that George VI, who was so ill, might die, and there were certain people at court who didn't want the Mountbattens to take power. And so he was seen as an alternative. So they were...
So hold on one sec, just to jump in there. How old would have Elizabeth been at this time? Queen Elizabeth II.
Well, 1946, 1952.
She was less than 20. I mean, she was 25 when she ascended the throne.
OK, but older than, for example, skip 2 monarchs ago, Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne as an 18-year-old. So there would be no reason to think anything other than that she would automatically step up. Why would he think he had a role to play?
Because there was talk about a regency. So rather than because he was ill.
She's not a child, she's an adult.
And incapacitated. The feeling was that he was so ill that he would be, you know, unable to rule, and a regency would ensue. And that the people in charge of that regency would be the Mountbattens. And they were, you know, a polarising force within the court at that time, because Uncle Dickie had so much power, because his nephew, I think it's his nephew, Prince Philip, was, I don't think they were engaged at that time, but certainly Philip and Elizabeth were being pushed, you know, well, together. So can I say there was a whole lot of politics and intrigue that surrounded King George VI's illness, and he was on the verge of dying several times before he eventually died in 1952. So they were lured back on the promise that maybe Edward could play a role in a regency.
Right.
And so they ended up in the Earl of Dudley's house at Ednam Lodge in Surrey, and it was while they were there that her jewels were stolen. OK, so let's just go through this trip, bit by bit, if we can. So she turns up and is offered by the lady of the house the access to the strong room to store any valuables. And she says, no, thank you. It's OK. I'm going to keep my valuables with me in our rooms. And she decides that they will be cared for by her maid. That's right, which was the done thing at the time. Right. By the way. OK. And where were they put? Well, now, we are not talking about you know, a little jewellery box or a case. We're talking about a trunk of jewels. And
almost like a pirate's trunk of treasure. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, it was.
Wow.
It was either a Goya or a Louis Vuitton specially made trunk that was kept under the bed.
Far more than she took along, far more than she could possibly even think about wearing.
Yeah,
as well, right?
But she was
Absolutely.
well known for travelling with 56 trunks on occasion.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was just to put it in context. It wasn't as if this was the only trip that she travelled with lots of cases and lots of jewels.
This was pretty standard practice. Yeah?
I think so.
But this was her first trip back to the UK since the abdication, as you know, a married pair.
And then the day of the theft, she says to her maid, move those jewels from under your bed and put them into my room under her bed. Would that be right?
Well, actually, they were. It's worse than that. They were laid out on the bed.
Wow.
For some reason. Now, this is while they were both in London at the time.
So they'd gone for dinner.
Yes, they went up to London for, you know, to have something to eat, for a meal, for an event, something like that. And the jewels were
with
left...
Lady Dudley and Lord Dudley, yeah.
So the jewels were left unguarded.
Where were... I mean, the house had security, the house had staff. Where was everybody?
Well,
and how did
you
the
know,
intruder get in?
security, no, but there were staff. But the funny thing is that when the jewels were reportedly or reputedly stolen, the staff were having their dinner downstairs. So it was completely unguarded. Not only that, but I think the maid was out walking the dog. So this thing was like, it was like open sesame.
And what's the theory as to how the jewels were accessed by a thief? How did they get in? How long were they in for? What did they escape with?
Well, this is what I talk about in the book, that there is a theory that it was, you know, a cat burglar or a couple of cat burglars that scaled the walls, got in through the window, knew exactly where to go, what bedroom to access. And
so a cat burglar suggests the chance that this is somebody that really knew, A, who was staying, and B, they targeted that room specifically looking for her haul.
That's what the view is. That's what the view is, that this wasn't a random or a chance theft, that this was somewhat planned.
Could it have been an inside job? Because there's certainly been suggestions of that made.
Absolutely, that there have been, you know, there were suggestions that it was an inside job. It goes to three questions, right? Was this, you know, a theft where they had no knowledge? Was this a theft where they had some knowledge or, you know, a complete knowledge? Or was this a theft which they took full opportunity to
make claims on the insurance?
Embellish.
So to claim on the insurance for more than they had originally had taken.
Yes.
OK, so that's three theories.
Can I just jump in there?
Please.
Because, I mean, Richard tells the story really well in his book, and, you know, I'm sure everyone would want to read it because it's utterly believable that possibly this was organised. I don't have a view either way except to say that it is completely believable because Edward and Wallis were known for constantly telling everyone that they had no money. After the abdication, all the stories that I've been told were wherever they went, they expected other people to pay for them because they would say, we've got no money, you know, we really depend on you paying, and it was considered an honour. But more than that, it goes back to the essence of the abdication itself, which was organised in a big hurry in December, very cleverly by Baldwin. He knew it had to be sorted out before Christmas.
Baldwin?
Baldwin, the Prime Minister, who knew that you couldn't let this drag on over Christmas. And anyway, Edward wanted Wallis, and her divorce was in the throes of being finalised. So Edward told what historians subsequently call a suicidal lie. He told his brother, who had been jumped onto the throne with a few days' warning, Bertie, who took the name George VI because he wanted to show continuity. So he knew it was important that he took his father's name. So there was very little time to sort everything out, and Wallis was already abroad shouting at him to get more money. She hadn't really wanted this to go ahead, but if it did, she wanted money, and he wanted to organise things. So he told his brother that he really had no money, having been left in his father's will a life interest in Sandringham and Balmoral, but furious that he hadn't actually been left real cash and money.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So he then said to his brother, "I've got nothing," which subsequently everybody knew, but not at the time, was not the case. And so there was talk of perhaps the government would vote them an allowance of 25,000. And again, the politicians and Baldwin and even Churchill was involved in this discussion, said, "I don't think that would be very popular. And there may be an argument in Parliament over giving him the money. You can't, it'll drag out. You can't allow this to happen." So to step in and make it swift before Christmas, George VI said, OK, he'd pay himself out of his own allowance. So he paid a sum of money, and that's what historians call the suicidal lie. And I'm spending some time explaining this just to show that where money was concerned, they couldn't actually be trusted. So even though you're the expert and I don't really have a view on the burglary, anything is believable as far as they're concerned where money is at stake.
And just to build on what Anne was saying, that they were on the scrounge for money, literally, because the lifestyle that they had was, it was like a second court almost.
By court, you mean they were trying to build a second? In their life in exile, they were trying to re-establish what they'd abdicated from here at home.
Absolutely.
And that costs a king's ransom.
A ton of money. But there are also cases where they would say to Cartier, or they would say to Van Cleef and Arpels, or to Harry Winston, "Look, I'm going to this ball," she would, or the Duke, "I'm going to this ball, don't have anything to wear. Can you loan me, a particular piece?" "Oh, of course," because, the publicity, you get whatever. And they would never be returned. And it got swallowed up into the collection, which is what Anne was talking about the collection.
Okay. So, Vice, maybe are those words to those effect ever reached your professional ears? Were they known to hold on to things that were loaned?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's what's indicated in the book, which is really fascinating. So I would say that today, when you look at some of the big gala events, I mean, things are orchestrated so carefully. They're insured, documented. No one would have a chance to get, a big famous necklace and kind of just let it sit in their own collection. So I think this would have been unprecedented from these houses, and I think they would have liked the publicity. But my question is that why did they then keep coming back for more and lending, a second or a third time if they were not getting these pieces back?
Yeah, with that
because of the name. I mean, I visited a jeweller in New York as part of my research, and I was given a similar story, how Edward would arrive with pockets full of stones. He believed in breaking things up.
Yes.
He didn't believe that the authenticity meant you had to keep it in its original setting. And he was, to do him justice, given a lot of jewellery himself as Prince of Wales, so some of it was actually his own.
Yeah.
But he would break it up, and he'd have pockets full of stones, and he'd get on the floor with this particular jeweller, and he'd arrange it, and he'd then say, "Well, I've designed it, I'm the designer, so really I shouldn't have to pay for this because I'm the designer." And it's the same sort of story. So then they'd wear it a bit and then they'd take it back and expect not to pay for it, but always arguing about how much he should pay or pay nothing at all.
This is also one of the fascinating things about gemstones and diamonds, and they're virtually untraceable. And so you don't know if they come from some piece that he was gifted when he was, on one of his royal visits, or whether it comes from one of the houses. The question is how much of this was actually documented, how much were they aware of what came from what parts, stones are recut as well. So even if they were documented somewhere, you break it off a piece, you have it recut, and nobody knows where the stone comes from.
So this is entirely plausible. Can I just add as well that around the time of the war, during the war era, where the crown jewels were stored
was in a biscuit. Well, the jewels were actually stored in a biscuit tin in the grounds of Windsor Castle.
Right.
There's stories about the King George VI and his librarian Owen Maudsley getting pliers and taking out diamonds and sapphires and stuff and putting them into a biscuit tin, sealing it, and that's where it stayed for the duration of the war.
But the late Queen's Nanny Crawford,
yes,
also tells the story of looking after a young Elizabeth and Margaret, and them literally just having to open.
And that's in the book, yes, absolutely.
Yes. Please tell me that.
Well, just chests of stuff which were in, a dungeon in Windsor Castle, and the key was held by the King's librarian at the time, Owen Maudsley, and all anyone had to do, well, they need to be authorised, was to ask Sir Owen for the key and go down some flights of stairs into the dungeon, unlock, and there'd be these chests on bare ground. And literally,
just like in the movies, overflowing.
And I think I quote, the Count of Monte Cristo in one of these,
It's fascinating.
chapters.
I'd not heard the biscuit tin one before. Wow.
Yes, but what really strikes me is the fact that they were using pliers, Tobias, to prise these gems
Had you heard
out.
this, Tobias? I mean, it's quite remarkable, isn't it?
First of all, the gems, do move around. They unset them and reset them.
Yeah.
And all you need to do is break a little bit of the metal, as long as you don't damage the gem. But obviously you can massively impact a stone's value by damaging it. But just recently, Queen Camilla, had a couple of the Cullinan stones set in her crown, and they were moved around because they were being worn by the Queen as brooches. They were called granny chips. But if you actually look at the history of, there's a lot of people who fled and who have grabbed stones along the way, and in the history of the monarchy, that's definitely the case. But one of the most fascinating stories is the Cullinan itself, which I don't know if you know much about it, but it's become a very important part of the crown jewels. But that was a stone discovered in 1905 in South Africa and was gifted to Edward VII. And they had a big ruse when they transported the stone. So this was a 3,100 carat. There you've got the sovereign scepter, which is just magnificent. So that's a 530 carat stone.
Whoa.
But that came from, it's enormous. But that came from this 3,100 carat rough diamond that was discovered and then gifted. And then there was a big armed convoy that brought it back to England with much fanfare.
That's right.
But actually, it was so. There's two different rumors about how it was actually transported, because that was a ruse. One of them is the family Asher, so the people who cut this at the time, and they've actually got one of the main diamond cuts named after them, so the Asher cut, transported in his coat pocket back to England, and the other one it was sent by Royal Mail, basically, while the big convoy, was going with an empty box.
So this really does give us some ground to work from, in terms of, like, when you think, well, how on earth could this 1946 robbery have taken place? How were the jewels left just laid out on a bed? A maid was walking the dog, they were out for dinner. How on earth was this enabled to happen? But actually, when you talk about biscuit tins and Royal Mail deliveries, suddenly everything seems quite plausible, doesn't it?
The most transportable form of wealth there is.
Wow. Would a heist like that happen today, and would they get away with it?
No. Well, that's my view. The other thing about that 1946 burglary was that there is no, a definitive list of what was actually stolen. There was an official list which, under press duress, had to be released by the Duke and Duchess because there was so much, a furore around it, and the insurers released the list. And on the list there are about 10 to 15 items. I forget exactly which, but the list is there. And at the bottom of the list was the enigmatic words, etc.
The other thing about this heist, robbery, fake, whatever you want to call it, is actually, being the boring historian here, it's setting it in the context of 1946. The war was only over by 1 year, so a lot of people were leading unsettled lives, but here are a pair of itinerants, actually. They didn't have anywhere to live. And what I would say about why they kept coming back, actually, is that when Edward abdicated, and this goes to the heart of what happened when he abdicated in a hurry, he hoped he'd come back to Fort Belvedere. He never expected to give it up. He didn't believe he'd committed a crime or done anything wrong. He thought the British people would forgive him. I don't think he actually wanted to come back as king. I think he wanted to come back with a title, and particularly a title for Wallis, because don't forget, she was just created ordinary Duchess of Windsor, no HRH. So effectively they were humiliated and exiled because nobody could curtsy to her. She didn't have a title. So I think he hoped to come back, live in Fort Belvedere, the life of Riley, to be an ex-king and have all the joys and pleasures. But there was no way the British people were going to forgive them, because actually, as far as the British people were concerned, George VI and Queen Elizabeth were now firmly adored. They'd been courageous during the war. So this couple, who hadn't been in England, who'd lived in the Bahamas, and who'd complained all the time about their life, were not going to be easily forgiven and allowed to live in Fort Belvedere. And without HRH, Edward was never going to humiliate his wonderful wife and bring her back because she wouldn't be curtsied to. So effectively they had nowhere to live in 1946, and I think that's relevant to the jewellery because, it wasn't.
They didn't have anywhere to store it, is what you're saying.
Well, it wasn't as if they were living in bedsits. Everything's relative. They were living in the south of France, but they were waiting to see how things panned out. Edward had this ranch in Canada. He would have been quite keen to live in America, but Wallis didn't want to live in America again. She felt that she'd been there, done that. And they couldn't live in England without being properly recognised. So they didn't really know where to go. So they were a pair of itinerants, albeit, I wouldn't actually describe them as homeless, but I think it puts the whole thing...
No fixed abode.
No fixed abode. That's a very good way of putting it.
There we go. Let's take it back to before the abdication. Richard, you suggest in your book that actually you believe Edward originally intended to renounce his claim to the throne before his father passed. So actually, he wanted to clear the path and be with the woman that he loved.
Well, that's not strictly what I believe. What I believe is that he never took it seriously.
When you say it, you mean being king?
Being king seriously. It was something that he dreaded, because he dreaded the life that his father was leading, King George V, which was extremely boring and, just regimented. He was a young man who was out on the town most of the time. Edward would never shave in the morning because he wouldn't get to bed until about midday. He would sleep and then he would shave for dinner. And then after dinner, he would go out on the town. That was the life that he led, and he found the whole Balmoral Sandringham thing tedious and dreary, and boring. But he loved the money, and Anne was saying that's the thread that runs all the way through this story. It's money. He was never rich enough in his view, and certainly the turning point in the whole story was when the will of his father was read to them at Sandringham, and whereas his brothers all received £1 million in cash...
A lot of money back then.
Huge amounts of money. He was left with nothing.
Well, you say that.
Sandringham and Balmoral.
Well, But he wasn't given any cash, although he did have revenue from the Duchy of Cornwall.
Of course.
But he couldn't see that. Well, he chose to ignore that. It was the fact that his brothers got all this money. Where's mine? And that was a turning point, I believe, in how he viewed things. I believe after that point, he was determined to cash in whatever he could, which meant taking things because he felt he'd been hard done by.
Okay. Let's talk about Edward's mother, Queen Mary. Yes. She was not a fan of Wallis Simpson. And reports were reaching her that, for example, when £50,000 worth of jewellery were bestowed upon her from him at Christmas, a further £60,000 worth a week later to celebrate the new year. And she was like, whoa, 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 whoa. So she started to divvy up jewels and give them away to prevent him passing them on to Wallis, who she clearly was not a fan of. Is that how you read and understand that relationship?
That's my understanding, is that she was scared stiff. Don't forget, she was the first real chronicler of the royal jewels, because they literally during Queen Victoria's time, they were still in trunks, and some of it was scattered all over the place. Queen Mary was the first one who attempted to just catalogue all of the jewels in the royal, collection. She was also known as the Royal Magpie because she was hell-bent on reacquiring pieces that were of significance to the throne, and the book talks about the means that she used to do that. But it got to the stage in 1936 when he was king, and literally as king, he had discretionary rights over everything. People believe that the crown jewels are the property of the British people. They are not. They are the property of the monarch. There is a law that prevents them from being taken out of the country, but as I say in the book, there is legal precedent that says that these items are the property of the crown. And as king, you have ultimate discretion over that property. That's what she was afraid of. And she even I just consulted lawyers about how this looting, I'm using the word, could be stopped, because it was just getting out of control.
But listen, it wasn't all about jewellery.
No,
I realised that that's a really interesting strand about Queen Mary. She was deeply worried about her son marrying this woman who she thought was unsuitable. They feared blackmail on a grand scale because Wallis had 2 husbands living. And with 2 husbands living, they failed to understand the entire basis of the relationship. They thought that Wallis was driving it. Now, Wallis was grasping. I'm fully prepared to accept that. But actually, at a certain point, it was not Wallis driving the relationship. It was Edward.
Absolutely.
So I think Queen Mary and the royal family were horrified, of course, about jewellery, but it went much deeper than that. They were horrified at what would happen if Edward actually married Wallis. And what they failed to realise is that Edward was the one driving it, and I actually believe he didn't want to be king. So I think, although it wasn't a plot or a coup or anything like that, I think he saw Wallis. If he had been allowed to marry Wallis, I think he would have been king because he would have felt secure with Wallis by his side.
But he did marry Wallis, but after he abdicated.
Exactly.
So talk to me about how things worked out for them as newlyweds post-abdication. Were they good times?
No. As far as I'm concerned, it's downhill all the way. I think that they really became superficial café society. They failed to find a role for themselves. Now, you can blame the British establishment for not being able to, but during the war, Edward, unquestionably, as Duke of Windsor, was defeatist. And you could not have an ex-king of England running around Europe, possibly being kidnapped and used by the Nazis in that role, and also being defeatist. So to an extent, he had to be got out of the way. He had to be managed. So he was sent as governor to the Bahamas, where actually Wallis did a decent job as governor's wife. They built a canteen and they looked after downed airmen. She wanted any excuse to go to America, to the mainland, that she could, and they complained about the government house not being good enough, and they felt they'd been sent in exile to Elba. This was, I mean, Wallis had a sharp tongue, and this was their exile in Elba. After they'd served their time in the Bahamas, where were they going to live? They had nowhere to live. So they were sort of wandering about, looking for a job. But since Edward had so failed in the one job that he'd been given, in 1939, when war broke out, and Edward was sent back to France, and his role was really to look after the British troops. It was much bigger than that. But cast your mind back to Dunkirk. All those little ships, all the British soldiers needing to get out, life or death. It was a more dramatic moment in British military history, couldn't be imagined. What was Edward doing? His job? Overseeing the evacuation? No. He was at Cartier in Paris, organising a brooch for his beloved wife, Wallis, for whom he was terrified. He'd got her out of Paris safely. And here we have it, this wonderful flamingo.
This is, so instead of overseeing the safe evacuation of all of those incredible
Wallis's
men and women.
birthday is June the 19th. So on June the 19th, it was absolutely imperative for Edward that he had to give Wallis this flamingo, which pushed jewellery engineering to the nth degree. He went into Cartier and he said, my wife isn't particularly tall, but I want her to be able to wear the brooch not just on the side here, which was the cliche, but possibly in the middle. And if she bends down, I don't want the leg poking into her. So the leg is a retractable leg. And that's why. In fact, she did wear it. There's a picture of her going off to the Bahamas when she was being sent to this posting, and she wore it on her lapel. But there it is. And that's why Edward couldn't be trusted to be given a job, because nobody quite knew what he was capable of. And he was so bitter at this point that his wife had not been given royal initials, that they wandered Europe waiting to see where they would settle.
What happened to her after his death?
Well, he died in 1972 from lung cancer. And Wallis was terrified. She was in her early 70s, and she had planned that she would be buried at Frogmore alongside it, she and he, because that was one of their big worries. Where would they be buried, and would they be buried together? But she had to go back to Paris alone. She had no family, no children, and a few friends, but friends on a transactional basis, largely. And she was desperately worried that she wouldn't have enough money. Here it comes again, and how was she going to live?
And Richard, soon after the Duke's death, his long-term valet, Sidney Johnson, was dismissed. There was a cost-cutting exercise, and suddenly...
Yes, so there was a changing of the guard, because up until 1972, the Duke had managed all of their affairs. Wallis literally didn't have to do a thing. She just had to receive things and borrow things. So when that ended, but the Duke had put in place some very astute and powerful people that would manage the affairs. But as the years passed, she was stricken with, she had a stroke. She had, hip surgery, which at that age, and with the, a medical, techniques at that time was not an easy operation for a woman. She was extremely slender, extremely thin. She was a scarecrow. She got even thinner as the years, progressed. So she gradually there was an advisor at that time, Maître Suzanne Blum.
Who was the wife of the late Duke's Parisian attorney, lawyer.
Yeah.
Yes. And her relationship with the Duchess grew stronger and stronger and stronger. And gradually, Maitre Bloom took over the running of affairs.
Tobias, what do you know in terms of what became of the jewellery that had belonged to Wallis Simpson?
We know what happened in 1987 with the auctions, and that's the only real documentation that you have. There was, you know, several subsequent sales as well. So Fayed, who had bought, Al Fayed had bought lots of pieces, and he had an auction in 1998, but that was not mainly for jewellery. He didn't just buy the pieces,
did he? He bought the house, right? So this is Mohammed Al Fayed, Dodi Fayed's father,
he
who was killed alongside Princess Diana.
Yeah, he actually didn't buy the house. He leased the house from Jacques Chirac, who cut him a really good deal.
Yeah.
That's the house on the Bois de Boulogne.
OK, so let's talk about
the Villa Windsor. But
yeah.
the problem is that a lot of the jewellery, it can be broken down, and they did that constantly. So
they did that.
Yeah, they did that.
And actually, you know, just to come in there, sorry, Tobias, but it was one of the features of the Duke's will that he wanted the jewellery broken up. He specifically said he wanted the jewellery broken up. But the romantic reason was that he didn't want any other woman to wear what he had given Wallis. Yeah. But it was never. Was
that in his written wishes?
It was. Well, I can't verify that, but it was certainly part of his instructions to his lawyers that he wanted the collection broken up. Wallis, of course, didn't want it broken up. So that was actually.
But there is some traceability. So we know, for example, that, you know, her engagement ring was bought by Cartier, the 19-carat emerald, a beautiful stone. It came from a much bigger stone, which was split into two, and you know, the other piece was used by other people. So you've got some things like that. You've got, you know, the gorgeous yellow diamonds that she wore, which were brooches. It was a 50 and a 40-carat matching pair. You know, gorgeous stones, but again bought by Cartier. So and obviously, I don't know, who knows how they paid for it, because again, there's no verification for these things. Did they trade other gemstones in? A lot of the jewelry that they did create, where did the gemstones come from? Was it purchased? Did it come from the insurance money? They created replicas. I mean, there's lots of questions about these things. But because it wasn't, you know, because there wasn't an officially published documentation of all the jewelry that sits in with the royals in all their various places, what we've got knowledge of is what's on public display, what gets used. So the crown jewels.
The Cartier archive has bought back whenever it can,
yes,
and with good reason, because, you know, a lot of the animal jewellery, Wallis was known as
flamingo
wearing
was
and the panther,
Le Panthère, but actually it was the mistress Jeanne Toussaint at Cartier who was the original panther, who made a lot of the jewellery. So in 2010, you've got a sale of the onyx and diamond articulated leopard bracelet, which is, there it is. That's been on my wrist. I was allowed, probably contravening all the rules, but at the 2010...
Don't blame you, Anne.
I was allowed to have that on. It is unbelievably light. If you want a panther on your wrist, I'd recommend.
But there is no doubt, is there, that this couple were controversial. They were infamous. They were magpies. And that collection, just the pieces alone that went to auction in Geneva, I mean, at the time, it was 87. How much was achieved through that sale, do you remember?
$50 million, basically.
$50 million.
Yeah.
In today's money?
I mean, it would be at least 100, probably 200 million. Wow. Which just makes sense. I mean, if you look at some other...
And this from a couple that worried they were going to run out of cash. I mean, goodness me. But I think what this show has illustrated is that there are so many questions. There are so many possibilities. The fact is that all these years on, we are still talking about Edward and Wallis Simpson. I don't think that will ever change. Thank you very much for raising so many important questions in your book, for adding so much credibility in this space, and Anne, for being the font of all knowledge when it comes to all things Edward and Wallis Simpson.